Welcome to Fox Soul's Black Report, your space for Black news, views, and opinions. Today is Wednesday. Happy Hump Day, February 23rd. I'm Seth Lemon.
I'm Demetria Obalor.
I'm Romeo.
I'm Demi Lobo. And on today's report, the White House says Russia has enough forces in place to conduct a full-scale invasion of Ukraine within the next 48 hours. We're on the ground in Eastern Europe as troops await orders. Meanwhile, President Biden is reportedly days away from nominating his pick for the Supreme Court. We take a look at the final round of contenders. Then, D.C. officials are monitoring the possibility of a trucker protest threatening to bring traffic currently on the Capitol Beltway to a complete standstill.
Plus, a popular fast food chain is adding staff to its workforce, replacing traditional cooks with artificially intelligent robots, and layaway for your getaway. One airline introduces a new option to book your vacations and worry about the bill later.
We have all of that and much more. This is Our Voice and Our Truth, so let's get to it.
Welcome in. Ukraine is very close to declaring a nationwide state of emergency. Officials began mobilizing military reservists ages 18 to 60 today, calling on any remaining citizens that are in Russia to leave immediately under the threat of war. Now, Ukraine's head of national security says the country's army is ready as a result of Vladimir Putin's annexation of Ukrainian territory. President Biden, because of that, announcing new economic sanctions against Russia intended to cut Russia's government off from Western banks and funding. The sanctions will also reportedly target oligarchs who benefit from Putin's political practices. Now, here joining us to break down the latest in Ukraine is Terrell Starr. Terrell is the host of Black Diplomats podcast and senior fellow at the Eurasia Center's Atlantic Council. Thanks for being here with us, Terrell. Secretary of Ukraine, the National Security Secretary, he said that these measures that they're looking at are preventative measures to keep calm in the country so that things can function. Are you calm? Are others around you calm? Is there a sense of calm at all right now?
Well, it depends on where you are. Across the country in general, absolutely, because here in Kiev, the state of emergency that was just enacted really doesn't impact the day-to-day flow of what I do or what most Ukrainians do. We are calm because this is something that's been going on for the past 8 years, and so the escalation is taking place in the east. In regards to the 48 hours in which Putin could, launch a larger invasion, there are a number of things that can happen. The capital of Kiev, where I'm at, could be surrounded by troops. That's not an unfamiliar tactic that Putin has used. When I was in Georgia in 2008, when the Russians attacked, they split the country in half. And so that war lasted roughly 8 days. And so while the news reports are very serious, here in Ukraine, we are very calm. In fact, on Saturday, I'll be going to a civilian military course that's a day long where it teaches us how to survive in warlike situations.
I wanted to ask you about that because we've seen video of civilians who are practicing and training with military-style rifles, even grandmothers who are learning how to shoot. This is a real thing. They actually are teaching citizens there in Ukraine how to defend themselves in case this happens.
Absolutely. And so you have children as young as 8 years old, 8 and 10 years old, because what's really happening here is that in order to really deal with the threat that is Russia, there is a grassroots mobilization amongst, pockets of people in this country to prepare. So if you are, it doesn't matter if you're an 80-year-old grandma, if you have a finger and you can pull the trigger, and you could be utilized. And so and obviously Russia is the second most powerful military in the world behind the United States, but the whole genesis of this grassroots mobilization is to say that we're not going to be enslaved, that we're not going to bow down to you, and we're not going to welcome you with cookies and milk. That's pretty much what that is.
So Putin gave the directive yesterday for forces to move into these 2 regions on the eastern coast of Ukraine that he claims are already under Russian control. He says they're pro-Russian. And you said you're in Kiev. I know it's a little further in west, not on that side. But what is the goal here? He's inching along, it seems. Is he testing the waters and trying to take NATO's temperature, take Biden's temperature as well?
Yeah, he absolutely is. He wants to know what he's going to get away with. And one thing that's important to note about Russian President Vladimir Putin is that he's not accountable to anyone. And so if these measures were taken in the United States, you can think about Iraq, for example. You know, we can have to talk about George Bush, but there were massive protests against that, you know, and there were massive grassroots movements that spoke out against this war. In Russia, if you were to protest, you can literally go to jail for holding up a protest sign.
Yeah.
And so civil liberties and things don't exist there. So it's not that all Russians are for this. It's that they is so severely suppressed there that, you know, if you do show any opposition, then you will be severely punished. But what he's trying to do is to determine what I could get away with. And if they do sanction, how severe will the sanctions be? And how, because ultimately what Putin has learned is that he can get rewarded for bad behavior. He's still a part of major organizations. He still gets to meet, you know, various leaders around the world. He's still welcome to come to Washington.
And so I guess that's the concern. Some of the Republicans here in the states are saying that his actions have not gone far enough, that he hasn't learned from 2014. And so with these sanctions, they're saying it's not enough. Those sanctions on 2 Russian banks, that would hurt them financially, but will it really do anything to dissuade Putin from moving forward? It seems like he is intent on doing this.
No, it won't at all, because it doesn't matter, because again, Putin is not accountable to anybody. And it's just interesting if Republicans talk about the fact that the sanctions, you know, if I heard you correctly, they're not strong enough, because what really makes Putin powerful in the oligarchs that support him powerful are the loopholes in the West, including the United States. Through loopholes through real estate, where oligarchs can offshore their money and other financial systems. But yeah, pretty much what Putin wants. You know, there's not much that the United States can do, and really to stop him from continuing this invasion. What will hurt is that you hit his pockets directly, and that's not something that the states have done yet. Will they do it in the future? Or will they do it in the future? That remains to be seen, but that's what people here in Ukraine and other corruption activists are looking for.
Do you foresee this escalating to the point where American troops will have to be on the ground there?
No, I appreciate you asking me that. So again, for those viewers, Ukraine is not under Article 5. And Article 5 means that if you attack one of us, you'll attack all of us, and they're not under Article 5 because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Now, here's the tricky thing about war. Mistakes happen. So what if a ballistic missile shot from Russia that was intended to hit Ukrainian soil hits Poland or hits Romania or hits Slovakia, or if some Russian offensive were to hit the Baltic states? Then that's a whole different conversation.
That's a much bigger escalation there. Yes. All right, well, we want you to stay safe while you're over there. We know we've seen some of the shelling going on, so we are praying for your continued safety. And as always, we appreciate you joining us here on The Black Report. Terrell Starr, always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Very insightful interview, Seth. President Biden is ordering 6,000 more troops to Eastern Europe to assist NATO's eastern flank. Biden says the United States has no intention of fighting Russia. He went on to say the troops are there in defensive positions. The latest troop movements come as the threat of a large-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine grows more likely. Russia has an estimated 190,000 troops near its border with the former Soviet country.
And yet another defeat for Donald Trump. The Supreme Court says they would not take up the former president's case, challenging the disclosure of his White House documents to the January 6th committee. The documents Trump was trying to block in court are already in the hands of Benny Thompson's panel. The High Court says Trump's lawyers provided no basis for them to override President Biden's decision not to uphold his predecessor's claims of executive privilege over the records.
The Supreme Court has agreed to hear the case of a Colorado web designer who says her religious beliefs prevent her from offering website designs to gay couples. Lori Smith says she also wants to post a statement on her website about her beliefs, but that's in conflict with Colorado's anti-discrimination law. Smith argues that the law violates her free speech and religious rights. Last year, the 10th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver denied her challenge to overturn a lower court decision ruling against her.
President Biden is expected to announce who he will nominate to the Supreme Court on Monday. The White House says the president has interviewed at least 3 candidates. President Biden pledging to nominate a black woman to replace Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, who is expected to retire in June. The president has said that he's done a deep dive and thorough background checks on his top candidates.
U.S. Capitol Police are asking the D.C. National Guard to help with support around Washington, D.C. ahead of next week's expected trucker protest. The protest is expected during President Biden's State of the Union address. Capitol Police want Guard troops to help with traffic control. Homeland Security and D.C. Metro Police believe truckers are preparing to cause traffic jams in and around the city. Authorities say it could be similar to the protests in Canada. Truckers there were able to shut down a bridge between Detroit and Windsor, Canada, stopping the flow of commerce for days. If the National Guard troops are activated, it will be the first use of a new law meant to make it easy for U.S. Capitol Police to request emergency help from the National Guard. The law was enacted as a response to the January 6 riots.
Federal prosecutors want the man photographed with Speaker Nancy Pelosi's lectern during the January 6th attacks to be sentenced to 90 days in prison. The U.S. Attorney's Office also says Adam Johnson should receive 1 year of supervised release and a $5,000 fine. Johnson pleaded guilty back in November to 1 count of entering and remaining in a restricted building or grounds. Sentencing guidelines for the case run between 0 to 6 months in prison. I think it's really important here to, of course, bring up the protests that we've seen regarding the Black Lives Matter movement over the past couple of years. An AP report showed that dozens of protesters, received on average 27 months in prison. So that's also people who, went off the deep end, looting a Target, Gucci. But to loot the Capitol, the most this man, Adam Johnson, is facing is 90 days in prison, 3 months here. This is an act of domestic terrorism. The fact that you can siege our U.S. Capitol, have our lawmakers hunkering down in their offices, traumatized, fearing for their lives, and the most you're getting is 90 days.
Yeah, I agree with you. January the 6th, if it was black people on those steps rioting, if it was people of color, I feel like there would have been a lot more bloodshed. I feel like lives would have been lost on that day, and definitely the penalty would be a lot harsher than what they are getting, right? We understand they disrespected our country. The rest of the world watched as our own people on our own soil did what they did, and it was truly wrong. So this is not enough at all.
Romeo, I absolutely agree with you. There's definitely a war on freedom of speech right now. And the goal here is, of course, to make black people fearful to protest. Dimitri, like you were saying, so many laws came into effect after George Floyd's death and, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement. And so when you give a white person 90 days in jail, that doesn't make them fearful at all to protest, but you make black people so fearful to go out and protest because we could go to jail for years.
Yeah. Federal prosecutors said that this guy was entitled and privileged, and that was clear from the photo. And apparently he hasn't had to work in more than a decade because he married wealthy. So all of that just puts into perspective, these people who claim to be blue-collar Americans fighting for our country. Yeah. Moving right ahead, an FBI raid and redistricting could put a reliably Democratic district up for grabs in Texas. 66-year-old Congressman Henry Cuellar, he won his 2020 Democratic primary election by just 4 percentage points, edging out progressive Jessica Cisneros. But FBI agents, they raided Cuellar's home and congressional office last year. Investigators said that stemmed from a federal investigation into American business ties around the world. But redistricting, it might also tilt that section of the state to favor Republicans. That's despite the district being overwhelmingly comprised of Latino Democrats. And former President Trump, he won roughly 45% of the vote in that area in the 2020 presidential election.
A black woman held at gunpoint by a Minneapolis area cop for having a gun permit is $100,000 richer. Janice Hodge was pulled over by Minneapolis Park cop Calvin Pham in a routine traffic stop in 2019. Pham says he stopped Hodge for using her phone while driving and not wearing her seatbelt. Police body camera footage shows a confused and scared Hodge with her hands just holding her purse. The stop quickly changes after the cop pulls his service weapon out on Hodge after he finds out she has a gun permit in her purse. The video shows Hodge being thrown to the ground by the officer. In Pham's police report, he never mentions seeing a weapon. The city settled a lawsuit with Hodge. Pham eventually resigned from the force.
A brutal weekend on New York City's subway system has forced the mayor and governor to come up with plans to deal with crime and homelessness on the transit system. There were 8 attacks over the weekend, but only one of them were committed by a homeless person. The mayor and governor released a plan to deploy police officers with mental health workers. It's the city's attempt to remove more than 1,000 homeless people who use the trains as shelter. Homeless advocates are leery of the new plan. They're worried the NYPD will harass homeless train riders. As we look into the crime rate and things that's going on within New York, subway robberies going up 47% in the last 28 days. Grand larcenies jumped 88%. There's a problem all across the country, but I think the bigger issue is this. We have a homeless issue across our country, and we have to know how to approach it and take care of mental health people when they have issues. How do we approach that where lives are not lost? But again, this mayor has hit the ground running, and he has a lot of things on his plate to handle in the city of New York.
You know, I love that, you know, for us it was so exciting to have a black man in such a big position of power, but also some of the things that he does, I'm just kind of like, I don't know if I'm feeling that same excitement about him, because him prioritizing, doing a mass sweep of he said that pretty much every homeless person, when you get to the end of the line, you have to get off the ground and kick people off the train. But you're not thinking that there are people that are not violent, that are not criminals, that go on the train and sleep because they have nowhere else to go. And so I feel like instead of doing a massive overhaul and making every single person that's homeless be a harmful person, find a place for those people who are not awful, find a place for them to go.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully these teams will be finding shelters for folks they call them the end of train or end of route teams that are going to respond and make sure that the lines are clear. But for me, I grew up in D.C. In comparison, you can't do many of the things that he's saying he wants to outlaw on trains already. There's no eating, there's no drinking, there's no sleeping on trains. That kind of thing is already prohibited in some subway lines. So, you know, Adams is trying to crack down, and 6 people stabbed just since Friday.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
There's got to be a reallocation of funds to protect the people who, of course, ride the lifeblood of the city, as he describes.
Exactly.
So, yes. Switching gears now to bad parenting. A Utah man is in jail after police say he told his 4-year-old son to shoot at police officers. You heard that right, shoot at police officers. Salt Lake City officers say they went to a McDonald's drive-thru Monday after being called by workers who said a man pulled a gun on them for getting his order wrong. One of the cops says his partner struggled to arrest Sadat Johnson. He saw a gun pointed at the other police. The officer swiped the gun as it fired. The bullet grazed the officer's arm, leaving a minor wound. The shooter was Johnson's 4-year-old son. Investigators say Johnson told his son to shoot. Johnson has been charged with felony child abuse and threatening use of a dangerous weapon. When you look at this, I feel like we have to commend the fine police work in this situation. First of all, to have a gun pointed at you in the backseat of a car, and also in that backseat of the car, first of all, you got the 4-year-old shooting, but there was also his 3-year-old sibling in the car as well. And so for those police officers to identify that that was in fact a child in possession of a gun and not fire back, I think we have to commend them on that, and of course, definitely address the terrible parenting here and charge them inappropriately and sentence them accordingly.
Yeah, as a parent, you know what, you just appalled when you see something like this or when you hear about something. But again, the police officer, I think you're right. They handled this well, because normally there's an instance where there's a faster reaction, and this could have turned out very, very bad for both sides. So I do applaud the police officer in this case. But look, this man, what he did with his kid was totally out of pocket.
Yeah, this is definitely child abuse. And I think that's the charge that they said that he'll be facing. It's just unfortunate to think that, you know, there are parents who a parent in this case who thought that it was okay to encourage a toddler practically to fire, and that makes me worry about what else the child was learning at home. So
yeah, I just think of the trauma of a 4-year-old learning something so young, and Demetria too, like you said, a 3-year-old next to you know, the child seeing this at so young. And so, not to blame anyone, but when children grow up and we see the decisions that they make, you know, we kind of have to look back to what happened when they were 3, when they were 4, when they were 5, and they were looking at what their parents did. And so we have to also take that into consideration.
Yeah, and I'm going to say this real quick. With video games, it does bring comfort to young kids to have something or hold something like that, because they play on the games or they play in the backyard. So that brings comfort. But this right here, so disturbing.
I mean, the kid could have killed himself. He could have shot his sibling.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
And that happens too often.
Absolutely.
It does.
Two Louisiana sheriff deputies are charged with manslaughter after they shot and killed an unarmed man inside his car last week. Isaac Hughes and Jonathan Lewis were also fired for their part in the death of Daniel Valley. Cops say they were sent to a home in Jefferson Parish to respond to a noise complaint. Investigators say the deputies believed it was a drug house. Valley, who was in a car near the house, reportedly started his truck instead of getting out like deputies ordered him to do. Surveillance video from a nearby house shows deputies fire into the truck. They told investigators they feared for their life, believing Valley would use his car as a weapon. But Parish Sheriff Joseph Lowe says the shooting was not justified.